Yes, as you've just heard, one of the things I'll be talking about, of course, is the joint role that DFID and ESRC are playing in some of this educational research in developing countries. What I'm going to do very briefly, though, is give you a quick run for anyone who doesn't know what ESRC is, a couple of slides just on the background to who we are. I suspect most people in the audience know who we are, but anyway. But what I'll also do is focus in on a couple of slides on our more general interests in education research as well, because again, I suspect there's people in the room here. While you may have a real focus on developing areas, there may be some of you who are interested in what we're doing, particularly on higher education in the UK and more in developed countries. So it's a roundabout way of getting to the end, which is to talk about what we're doing specifically with DFID. So just to anyone who doesn't know, ESRC is an arm's length public body. We get our money from government in a slightly different way to the way that DFID does. So we're arm's length, we're independent of government, and we fund things using three principles. We only fund the best work that we can find, the highest quality research. It has to have impact, and by that we mean we expect it to have academic impact, but we're expecting the work also to have social and economic impact, which is why our values fit neatly with a lot of the work that DFID is keen to fund. And also the work has to be independent. So it's independent of government steer. We do expect the work to be high quality, academically driven. This is, broadly speaking, our budget. We have about 200 million a year that we fund across the disciplines of social science. So we spread that around in a range of different ways. Responsive mode funding is the bottom-up open calls where academics come to us for any ideas they like, no steer disciplinary-wise or anything of that nature. On the other hand, we do have a strategic part of the portfolio, which is where we do steer some of the work, usually through consultation with the academic community about where that work should be steered. So broadly speaking, a couple of £100 million to spend on supporting social science. We fund a whole series of different things, research schemes, competitions, initiatives and so on, the things you're used to responding to. Centres and large grants is a major part of our portfolio. We fund things like the Institute for Fiscal Studies. We're the biggest, we fund about just over half of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. That's one example of one of the centres that we constantly fund. We also put a lot of money into major capital projects. So big resources like longitudinal studies, birth cohort studies. A number of the big birth cohort studies that are funded in the UK are funded by us, and we're just about to launch the new life study, 100,000 babies captured in pregnancy and followed for the rest of their lives. So captured at different intervals throughout that period. We fund a lot of postgraduate funding, and we also fund opportunities for seminars and knowledge exchange and so on. So that's a broad background of the sorts of things that we tend to have opportunities for. All of this is driven by our three strategic priorities, and they are economic performance and sustainable growth, influencing behaviour and informing interventions, and a vibrant and fair society. And of course you can think of many ways that a lot of the work in developing areas fits more than one of those priorities. Often some of the work that we fund does straddle those different priority areas. And we have fairly recently in February gone through a refresh of those priorities to decide what are the topics that we think for the next period before the next major spending review. So the period in the current spending review, in the 1 year 15-16 spending review, what are we expecting to look at? And down the left here you can see a range of the sorts of things that we're expecting to be funding in that period. I won't go through that long list. It is on our website if you're interested to go and have a look. One of them, of course, down here is higher education in UK and developing areas, and in fact with DFID we've expanded that to not just focus on higher education, but higher education is one of the areas that we're particularly keen to focus in on. We feel that there's a real gap in knowledge, not just in developing areas, but actually in the UK and elsewhere on higher education research more generally. There's a whole range of other topics here, and as I say, if you're interested in all the other things that we might be interested in funding in this period, in addition to all the responsive mode grants that we give out, which can be in any relevant science, social science area, then please do check the website. We're also very keen in the work that we do to partner with other organisations, and DFID actually is one of the best examples of that. We have a number of activities, as I'll show you later, where we've partnered with DFID already, and we're now, of course, embarking on this next one on education. But we're willing to partner with government departments, private sector organisations, charities, a number of different agencies, as long as they're happy to abide by the rule that we want them to match the funding, and secondly, that they abide by our quality, impact and independence rules. And that's worked extremely well in the case of DFID and indeed a number of other organisations. One of the things we're funding quite a bit of work around at the moment are what work centres. So we're working with a number of government departments, including the Cabinet Office, on establishing what works areas, in particular government department areas of interest. Ageing, education, and a number of other topics are coming up in that area. Here's the portfolio of development research that we funded mainly with DFID, not entirely, but mainly with DFID, and you can see also with the Wellcome Trust and other research councils, things like funds for poverty alleviation, the Africa Research Programme, zoonoses and emerging livestock systems, all sorts of different topics. And of course what we're now looking at is the one at the bottom, which is education systems research, and that's the new one that's coming around now. Just to step back a little bit, so that gives you a sort of insight into some of the things we've done in developing areas research, but we also of course have done a lot of work on funding education more generally. So education funding is something ESRC has been doing for decades. If you go back to the TLRP, that's perhaps one of the biggest initiatives we've ever had, £30 million on teaching and learning programme, primarily focused on UK experience, but not entirely. And then there's a number of other different schemes that have come up in the past. So throughout our history as an organisation, education has been one of the areas that we've focused in on, and of course it goes through peaks and troughs, as do most other disciplinary areas. And now we're starting to focus in on those two priorities, higher education and thinking about developing areas. So these are the two priorities, as I say. Higher education is something that our research committee and others have been convinced there's a need for us to start focusing a little bit more on higher education. We have a feeling that there's been quite a lot of research in the UK on research into school education and so on, but much less on looking at higher education and the way that it's done. And also we want to move with DFID to think about what needs to be done in the education space, particularly post the Millennium Development Goals. What's the next step? How are we going to move beyond access to think about outcomes, to think about systems, as we heard before? So why higher education in the UK? Well, I mean, I could put up goodness knows how long a list, but things like the introduction of fees, the increasing numbers of overseas students, the debates around widening participation, MOOCs and their arrival, the potential for changing the funding model in the higher education system, a lot of debate about that, challenges for graduates in the labour market, different country-specific models of delivery. Very, very simple things. Why do you do a PhD in the UK and it takes 3 years, but it takes 5 years in the US or in Germany? And is that based on evidence? Have we made a decision that actually the sort of PhD training we give is as good or bad or indifferent compared to those other countries? So there's lots of work, not only in the nature of teaching, but also in the way that higher education is funded, the way that higher education can be delivered. We're of course also interested, and the reason for being here today is to talk a bit about the higher education as an emerging priority and what we're going to be doing more generally in developing areas. And I think there's a whole series of interlinked topics here. It's actually quite a complex area, as we heard before. It's not as simple as thinking about a series of just one-off trials within certain school settings to try and work out what works. I think we've got to think much bigger about political contexts. We've got to think about the economic and social contexts and how they will influence and shape the way that education can be delivered. So we're very conscious that different countries around the world will have different ways of delivering this and different sets of problems to deal with. So there are 5 potential themes that we've been talking about at ESRC. These are things to do with organisation of HEIs and the HE system, equity and higher education participation, curriculum, pedagogy and modes of provision, higher education for the public good, and the academic labour market and how you get the right people into training. As far as the DFID interaction is concerned, though, I think that, as I've said already, there's a whole set of complex global societal challenges that are relevant to this. We do think it's very interdisciplinary. In perspective, that means interdisciplinary across the social sciences, but also into some other disciplines on occasion. We think that there's a range of topics that need to be addressed, and we've worked very well with DFID on a series of projects so far, so I suspect that we'll find the same ability to be able to come up with a set of topics that suit our academic community that we bring to the table, with DFID's at times slightly more applied desire to really get to grips with some of the questions that will solve problems, and I think that's been working extremely well. So, as I've said already, we'll fund a portfolio of research on critical policy areas. We're going to be focusing particularly on outcomes. We want to get concrete ideas that are going to help policymakers and practitioners shape and change what they're doing in relation to delivering education. And there are 3 key areas that are spelled out in the call that's going to go live very soon. How do interacting contextual dynamics enable or inhibit the delivery of higher education? Quality education. This isn't just higher education, but it can include higher education, but this is across the piece. How do specific policies or interventions, how are they working in those different contexts, how do they interact with the contextual dynamics, and what impacts are there beyond the education system? What do we have to take into account that's not just embedded within the education system? And then how do we better understand, measure and evaluate in quite difficult contexts the educational quality and learning outcomes as they come through? So finally, this is the, we heard a little bit earlier, this is the call that's going to be announced very soon, about £20 million over 3 annual calls. The first of those calls is going to be focusing in on effective teaching. We have about £5 million, I think, dedicated to that. You'll see that there's a range of different grant opportunities. So there's small grants up to 150k, and they can be fairly broad in scope. They can be on any topic. The medium grants, we really are focusing in on this effective teaching priority. The large grants we expect to be including effective teaching, but maybe broader than that because of the scale of the grants that we're willing to give out. So those can be grants up to £1 million for projects that obviously will have a much longer duration of something up to about 5 years. So we hope an exciting initiative, one that's going to be the beginning of our engagement in this area. As we see here, we have up to 20 million over 3 years. And I think as we learn from those outcomes as time goes on, I think DFID have already made it clear that they see education as a priority for them as they move forward. They're talking about very large sums of money being dedicated to this. And I think as we learn more during the first year or two of this programme, ESRC and possibly other agencies will be willing to have conversations about how we develop this even further if we're getting the sorts of exciting results that we're obviously imagining that we might.